There's an old Buddhist story about a group of monks who lived high in the mountains. Each morning before prayer, the youngest monk would be tasked with catching the temple cat, tying him up, and putting him in a closet. One day, the youngest monk, by now covered with claw marks, became frustrated and asked an elder monk why he was meant to tie up this cat every morning. The elder monk explained in great detail the deep spiritual significance of tying up the cat. A few weeks later, the temple welcomed an honored guest, a 94-year-old master monk. The master had grown up here at this mountain temple, but he had long ago moved far away. This was the first time he'd visited the mountain temple since his childhood. Before the morning meditation, the youngest monk, of course, began scurrying after the cat. The ancient master discovered him as he was placing the tied-up cat in the closet. The master at first was amazed and then began to laugh. He carefully untied the cat and set it free, then brought the boy before the whole brotherhood of monks. "Do you know the real reason your brothers tie up a cat each morning?" asked the master. The youngest monk began to nervously recite the lessons he was taught about the spiritual significance of tying up the cat, but the ancient master cut him short and patted him kindly on the head. "All of that is nonsense," said the monk. "I was the first to undertake this task when I was the youngest monk in this temple. There was a certain kitten who was so noisy that it interrupted our meditation, so the temple master instructed me to tie it up each morning. It must be that after my teacher died and I moved away, this original purpose was lost, and so for all these years your brothers have kept it on as a tradition and ascribed deep meaning to a task that no longer has any real purpose."
I love this story because it reminds us that there are many things we do each day without ever questioning why we're doing them. Sometimes we don't even realize we're doing them to begin with.
When I was younger, I had a friend who would always touch the roof of her car when she was running through a yellow light. When I asked her why she did this, she got embarrassed and she said she didn't even realize she was doing it. It was something her mother did when she was very young, and she just picked it up as a habit unconsciously. Over the years, she could not break the habit no matter how hard she tried, so I've always been wondering if years from now, her children and grandchildren might not be doing the same thing in their futuristic space-age rocket cars. These kinds of patterns of behavior can become embedded in wider society. When you take off your hat when you're entering a building, you're not thinking of head lice, and when you say bless you because your friend sneezed, you don't think they're possessed by demons. Here in Vietnam, if you see a cute baby, you might want to say that it's cute, but before you can say something nice about the baby, you have to say chut via, which means something along the lines of, "I'm stealing your baby's soul." Stealing your baby's soul? What's that all about? Well, a long time ago, when infant mortality rates were much higher, the Vietnamese believed that spirits and ghosts often stole the souls of babies. This is actually a pretty common folk belief that you'll also find in places like Russia and Ireland. Anyway, the whole idea is that before you say something nice about a baby, which will attract ghosts, you have to steal the baby's soul first so that the ghosts can't. It's kind of like calling dibs on the front seat of a car. Of course, Vietnamese people don't believe that ghosts steal baby souls anymore, so chut via is a fragment of past society still floating around in modern speech, kind of like bless you and the hats off indoors thing in the USA.
Everything we've talked about so far is pretty benign, but are there more serious implications to this phenomenon? Are there ways in which entire societies are simply going through the motions of activities and behaviors that are harmful?
Well, some would argue that our entire way of life, our very means of survival, are harmful remnants of the past. In the 18th century, Benjamin Franklin had this to say: "If every man and woman would work for 4 hours each day on something useful, that labor would produce sufficient to procure all the necessaries and comforts of life." In 1892, a Russian scientist named Pyotr Kropotkin calculated that if we all worked about 5 hours per day, we'd probably produce more than enough for everyone in society to live comfortably. And he backed this up with pages and pages of meticulous statistics and calculations. Now, in 1892, people were working a lot more than 5 hours per day, even more than 8 hours per day. Peasants in Russia were forced to work as many as 15 or 16 hours per day. Factory workers in the United States were working 50, 60, or more hours per week, and they were not happy about it. A war for an 8-hour workday was hard fought around the world for decades, and I do mean a literal war. The Haymarket Affair, the Pullman strikes, the Homestead strike, and countless other strikes and protests led to deaths of thousands of workers who fought valiantly for an 8-hour workday. In the United States, where I'm from, this war still rages on, but most of us don't even realize we're fighting it anymore. US workers put in about 300 more hours per year than workers in Western Europe, largely thanks to the lack of paid leave.
And this is all despite the fact that worker productivity has skyrocketed over the past several decades.
Take a look at this chart. I think it's one of the most important charts of our lifetime. It shows the gap that's emerged between wages and worker productivity since the early 1970s. That line that's going up and up, that's how much value we produce for each hour we spend working. And the line that's flattened out, that's how much we're getting paid.
So American workers are working more hours, and the hours we work are more profitable for the companies we work for, and yet we're getting paid roughly the same as we were over 40 years ago when adjusted for inflation. Now this sucks, but why is it happening?
The 8-hour workday was never meant to be the final goal of the working class. Back in the 1930s, the industrial workers of the world produced a campaign calling for a 4-hour day, a 4-day week, and a wage people can live on. We lost sight of these goals during World War II, but even in the 1950s and 60s, science fiction, speculative newsreels, and cartoons like the Jetsons showed that we still had faith in a future where workers worked less and enjoyed more leisure time.
Somewhere along the way, we've lost sight of those ambitions, and the idea of a 40-hour work week has been frozen and codified into our society, and for no real reason. Just like we say bless you when someone sneezes, we spend most of our waking hours working for companies which, by the way, are refusing to compensate us for our increased productivity.
Capitalists want us to believe that the free market benefits employees. They tell us that capitalism means having the right to choose where we work and what we do for a living. The harder we work and the better our ideas, the more success we'll have in life.
But is this really true? Do we all really have freedom to choose our own paths through life under capitalism? Certainly there are very rare examples of people rising up from poverty to become billionaires. There are some Americans who grew up poor and went on to become captains of industry. According to a 2006 study, the children of poor kids only had about a 1% chance of reaching the top 5% income distribution versus the children of rich kids, who had about a 22% chance. A more recent study by the World Bank shows that American workers actually have about the same chance of escaping poverty and staying out of it as workers in India and Bangladesh. And we actually have worse chances than workers here in Vietnam. Now think about that for just a second. We fought a war about 45 years ago ostensibly to free the Vietnamese people, yet since the war ended, American wages have stagnated while Vietnamese workers have been able to claw themselves from being bombed into the Stone Age to having a better chance of escaping poverty than American workers. So what were we fighting for anyway? Oh yeah, freedom, that's what we were talking about. In our capitalist system, it's all very, very free. Workers voluntarily trade their labor for wages. Nobody's being forced to do anything they don't want to do. I mean, it's not like the Soviet Union where workers were forced to do jobs that they really didn't want to do. But how voluntary is wage labor under capitalism?
My buddy ThoughtSlime made a great video delving into this question. I'll put a link to the full video in the description, but here's an excerpt to whet your appetite.
Even if I like my job, doing it is still not voluntary, because I have to have a job or I'll be destitute. And that's fine, but it presents a few problems. Like, it ruins our ability to negotiate for better conditions, more control over our workplace, or better pay. You have to work to live, but the boss doesn't need you specifically for anything. They just need people like you. They can get rid of you if you're too difficult, because there are a lot more people like you than there are jobs available.
In the United States, the average worker makes about $30,000 per year. The average worker has less than $1,000 in the bank and $6,000 in credit card debt and lives paycheck to paycheck. Now, under these conditions, if a worker is out of work for just 1 month, they will become financially devastated. A lot of us found this out the hard way during the financial collapse of 2008 and 2009. I sure did, and so did many of my friends and family members. I know some very talented people who were out of work for years despite sending out hundreds of resumes per month and trying desperately to get a job, any job. I was running a company at the time, and not only was I struggling severely just to keep the doors open, racking up debt and cutting the salaries of my employees, but we were also throwing out stacks of resumes every week from desperate job seekers.
What does out of work mean anyway? It's not like when the bank shat the bed in 2008, the world was materially changed in any way. There were still just as many office buildings, just as many factories, just as many human beings that needed to be fed and clothed and sheltered. So it wasn't the world that was out of work, it was the system, capitalism. The free market, which is supposed to give workers freedom of choice, did just the opposite. And when the powerful people at the top made bad decisions, they distributed their failures to the working class. This is possible because under capitalism, the labor market will always be a buyer's market. No matter what you do, your labor is a mere commodity. You see, capitalism is a machine that generates profits for its owners, and you're just a mere part in that machine, and every part is replaceable, and you will be replaced if a better and more profitable option comes along.
Human resources, human capital, that's all a worker is to a business.
a resource to be consumed, capital to be bought and sold. Even if you're a lawyer or an engineer, you're still just a part of the machine and you're eminently replaceable.
On the surface, the working poor and the comfortable middle class might seem to live in different worlds, but they do have some things in common.
Both groups are basically being bought and sold for a profit. The companies who hire them stand to gain a lot more revenue than they expend in taking them on board, and most of the people in both groups will be putting in at least 40 hours per week, probably even more, sacrificing almost all of their waking hours to company profits. The laborer making minimum wage and the executive making $500,000 a year probably both wish they could spend more time with their children. They both probably have passions and desires that are unfulfilled because they spend so much time at work.
In this sense, all workers really are being exploited by capitalism no matter how much they're being paid. But there are some key differences between workers which are fundamental to the functioning of capitalism. To begin with, these highly paid executives are compensated so generously precisely because they're instrumental in the administration of the exploitation of lesser paid workers. Marx called these highly paid managers and supervisors the petty bourgeois, or the small capitalists.
And these executives don't directly own the means of production, but they do keep the machinery of exploitation running by enforcing the will of the capitalists who benefit the most from the system. And they're arguably more vital for the functioning of capitalism than the capitalists themselves, since they act as enforcers and they're well rewarded for designing systems that extract as much value as possible from the labor of lower-ranking employees. It doesn't matter if we're talking about global corporations or a small business with a handful of employees, the mechanics are the same. The most successful capitalists utilize systems that squeeze as much value from employees as possible in order to maximize profits. Even quote-unquote perks like ping pong tables at the office and free snacks are only provided to keep workers at work longer.
The honest truth is that businesses under capitalism will only ever do anything for profits. They have to, because if you as a business owner don't put profits ahead of everything else, including your employees and the environment, then another more ruthless capitalist will come along and destroy you.
So let's get back to freedom. Here's an average worker working 40 hours per week for just enough money to scrape by, under constant pressure from petty bourgeois managers to work even harder, even though wages demonstrably do not increase with increased productivity. They can't quit their job and risk losing a month of work, and since they spend most of their waking lives at work, they have very little time or energy to search for other opportunities.
Is this really freedom, though? Is this kind of arrangement between a worker and their employer really voluntary?
In 2002, Saddam Hussein was elected the leader of Iraq with 100% of the votes. In 2014, Kim Jong-un was elected to the Supreme People's Assembly of North Korea with 100% of the votes. We tend to laugh at these kinds of news stories because they demonstrate that such regimes are democratic in name only. Clearly, these elections were only held to provide a flimsy illusion of freedom to prop up an autocratic regime.
In the book Inventing the Future, a distinction is drawn between these kinds of illusionary freedoms and synthetic freedoms. According to the authors, most societies only offer rights and freedoms in an illusionary way. We have the rights on paper, but in practice, it's almost impossible to exercise most of our rights.
So while a worker might have the freedom in theory to work wherever they choose, in reality, most of us are forced to choose between the binary of working at some job we really don't want to do for meager pay and just enough to scrape by, or not working at all and starving and being homeless. Not much of a choice.
There is a simple solution to this problem, isn't there? If you're not afraid of a little hard work, you could just roll up your sleeves and become a capitalist yourself.
After all, everyone has the right to start a business, don't they? There's nothing stopping you from hanging up your shingle, coming up with a great idea, and raking up some sweet, sweet profits for yourself.
Except, no. It turns out the average cost to start a business in the USA is about $30,000, which just so happens to be the amount of money that an average worker takes home in an entire year. Now, I've owned a few businesses myself in the past, and just the costs of legal fees, licenses, making sure a workplace is up to fire and safety codes, and other such expenses quickly add up to thousands and thousands of dollars. For the vast majority of workers, the right to start and own a business is an illusionary freedom. We just don't have the capital to be capitalists.
As long as the means of production are owned by a ruling capitalist class instead of those of us who do the actual work of production, the situation can never change. See, as technology advances, the stuff we need to be happy gets more complicated. A few hundred years ago, all we really needed to survive was food, clothing, shelter, stuff like that. But now we need electricity, we need internet, we need access to modern medicine, we need entertainment, and so much more.
Just as we used to struggle against nature to maintain our lives, we struggle today to maintain the quality of life. Fortunately, as our needs get more complicated, our means of production become more efficient. Now, as an aside, capitalists will always try desperately to take credit for these kinds of technological advances, but technology will always advance under any economic system. The Industrial Revolution in the United States took place at a time when slavery was still an accepted practice. Should slavery then be given any credit for these advances simply because they took place in a society that held slaves? The USSR was the first society to put a satellite in orbit and a human being in space, but capitalists are loath to give communism any credit for those advances. Humans will always advance technology. The real question is who controls the fruits of these labors and who does not? And the answer to that question relies entirely on who controls the means of production. It's very much in the interest of the capitalist class to convince us that without capitalism, human progress would grind to a halt. As Kropotkin put it, political economy has always confined itself to stating facts occurring in society and justifying them in the interest of the dominant class. Thus, it is in favor of the division of labor created by industry. Having found it profitable to capitalists, it has set it up as a principle. Under capitalism, it's the capitalist class and the petty bourgeoisie who benefit the most from this technological development, even though this development relies completely on the labor of millions of workers all around the world who toil for meager existence. To quote Kropotkin once again, millions of human beings have labored to create this civilization on which we pride ourselves today. Other millions scattered throughout the globe labor to maintain it. Without them, nothing would be left in 50 years but ruins. As long as we allow capitalism to reign, as long as we work day in and day out to serve a privileged class, our society will remain stagnant. Capitalists will always place themselves before the vast majority of humanity and benefit from advances in technology far more and earlier than the working poor who make that wealth possible.
Capitalists want to maintain a survival of the fittest society despite the fact that we are all, as a species, quite fit to survive. As a worker, your labor is worth 2.5 times what it was in the early 1970s, and yet your wages stagnate while the wealth gap explodes.
We have to demand a better system than capitalism, one in which we all benefit from scientific advances. A shorter workday is a start, and a good one, but the only practical solution is to use the principles of science and reason to harness the means of production to benefit all of humanity, not just one ruling capitalist class. As Marx puts it, freedom can only consist in human society rationally regulating their interchange with nature and bringing it under the common control instead of being ruled by it. By now, most pro-capitalists are probably screaming at me through their screen, capitalism isn't perfect, but it's a lot better than communism. If you hate capitalism so much, then why don't you move to a communist country? Well, I did.
5 years ago, I moved here to Vietnam.
And while it's true that things are a lot better here for workers than they are in the US, it's definitely not a communist country. I mean, it's ruled by a communist party and they have sickles and hammers everywhere, but the workers don't actually own the means of production in most cases.
In fact, one of the biggest companies in the world is a Vietnamese company called Vingroup. They sell clothes, they sell cars, they sell real estate, they have department stores and convenience stores.
And they're all owned by this guy, Pham Nhat Vuong, a billionaire who has direct control over the vast holdings of Vingroup and, by extension, over 40,000 employees.
Now don't get me wrong, I dig the socialist price controls they have here in Vietnam and other programs that benefit workers, and I know that the workers here have a relatively higher quality of life than American workers, as evidenced by Vietnam's very high position in the World Happiness Index and the USA's relatively low position. I'd much rather be poor here in Vietnam than back in the States. But this kind of communism, where an authoritarian state and corporate interests have arbitrary power over the masses, is not the kind of communism I advocate for. Not by a long shot.
You see, I'm an anarchist. An anarcho-communist to be precise, and I believe that we can give workers control over their own work without a big fancy state to oversee everything.
I've made a few videos about how I think anarchism might work in real life, and I'll also link to some books and other videos you might enjoy on the subject, but none of this is really relevant to you at all unless you are ready to start questioning the systems we have in place today.
Is an 8-hour workday really a necessity, or is it just something we consent to because that's the way it's always been? Does your boss have justifiable power over you, or is the power your employer have over you arbitrary and unjust? Why don't you have democracy at your workplace? Is democracy under capitalism really democracy at all? You're going to have to ask these questions for yourself, and if you're not ready to ask them, if you're not ready to question capitalism, or if you're fine with things the way they are now, well, you're in luck. Capitalism is firmly in control of most of our global institutions and shows no signs of weakening anytime soon. If you ask yourself these questions, I mean really consider them deeply, you might just come to the conclusion that we could come up with a better system than capitalism. Now, maybe you hate the communists of the 20th century, maybe that's left a bad taste in your mouth, and maybe it makes you hesitant to consider alternatives to capitalism. But remember, this is not a binary. The notion that we have to decide between communism as it existed in the 20th century and capitalism as it exists today is completely spurious. There are other alternatives you may not have considered.
Now, once you're ready, and once you've decided that you're tired of working long hours for little pay, and once you've decided you want more democratic control over your own work life, well, we in the left will be waiting for you. And once enough of us workers have decided that we want a change in this system, well, we might just be able to do something about it. Okay, one more time.